Good afternoon. I'm Deirdre Marsh-Girardi from the Sacramento County Office of Education and the Curriculum Specialist for the California Dyslexia Initiative. We are excited to have so many friends and colleagues join us in this learning opportunity. Welcome to the 2023-24 CDI Expert Webinar Series. In this year's series, we will learn more about the International Dyslexia Association's updated graphic on structured literacy instruction and what educators need to know about the content and principles of a high-quality structured literacy approach grounded in the science of reading. For our second webinar of this series, we are excited to feature Dr. Dale Webster and Dr. Carrie Thomas-Beck from Core Learning. There is a lot of wonderful content to be explored in this webinar, and I know you will learn a lot. To support our attendees, we've created a Padlet that will host the slides as well as the webinar companion document that includes discussion prompts and additional resources to further explore the webinar content. Recordings will be posted on our website about a week after the session. Next slide. The Sacramento County Office of Education, SCOE, is the project lead on the California Dyslexia Initiative, CDI. One goal of the CDI is to provide professional learning opportunities within the system of support and across California to build knowledge, skill, and capacity around the teaching and supporting of students at risk for reading struggles, including those with dyslexia. We are delighted to partner with our friends at Glean Education to deliver this expert webinar series to build awareness of dyslexia among our state educational stakeholders. It is my pleasure to turn the mic over to Jessica Hammond, founder and CEO of Glean Education, who is leading the coordination efforts for this webinar series.
Thank you, Deirdre. We are thrilled to partner with SCOE and the California Dyslexia Initiative to coordinate this webinar series for the third year in a row. For those of you who may not know about us, Glean Education partners with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training, school leader consulting, and web-based coaching. Our work aims to build educator understanding of evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. Next slide, please. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars, the second in a series of webinars this year on structured literacy. If you haven't registered for them yet, we'll be popping the registration links in the chat. Be sure not to miss them. Next slide, please. For this webinar, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Carrie Thomas-Beck and Dr. Dale Webster. Dr. Carrie Thomas-Beck is CORE's Director of Literacy. She comes to CORE after working 4 years as the dyslexia specialist for the Oregon Department of Education. In 2019, Carrie received the Excellence in Leadership Award from the International Dyslexia Association to recognize her contribution to improving outcomes for students with dyslexia in Oregon. Prior to joining the department, Carrie worked as a research associate in the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon for 10 years. Carrie developed and directed the CTL Reading Clinic at the university from 2008 to 2013, and she also led the development of Reading Endorsement Program at the university and taught courses on literacy in the College of Education. Dr. Dale Webster is CORE's Vice President of Language and Literacy. He leads the Educational Services Division and is responsible for the day-to-day operations, training, and quality control of CORE's educational consulting and management staff. Dale brings 20 years of experience in teaching, professional development, technical assistance, research, state-level policy work, administration, and curriculum development to schools, districts, and states across the country. Dale has served on the California Curriculum Commission, an advisory body to the California State Board of Education on curriculum frameworks and textbook adoptions, as well as numerous other state and local educational panels. Dale is also president of the Interactions for Peace, a nonprofit organization that teaches peaceful problem-solving skills to youth, and he's board member of the San Diego branch of the International Dyslexia Association. Please help me welcome Dr. Carrie Thomas-Beck and Dr. Dale Webster to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here today and talk with all of you about the what of structured literacy. As I think many of you know, we're just extending from last month. Barbara Wilson, our good colleague at Wilson Foundation, presented kind of an overview of the IDA structured literacy info map. And so we'll be honing in on that again, but just on one aspect of it this time. On the slide you see here, I wanted to point out that we're going to be pulling examples from CORE's Teaching Reading Sourcebook. Many of you may be familiar with that book. It's nationally recognized and used across the country in districts and also institutes of higher education. We've changed our logo as our part of our merger with Unbound Ed. And so I just wanted to connect those dots for everyone from the old logo of CORE here you see up in the source book to our new logo here. With that, we'll get started. You probably recognize this from last time, and what I would say is we're going to focus today on the what. And the first thing I'd like to really make sure that we're all clear on is understanding the language underpinnings of structured literacy and reading in general. So this reference here to the domains of language is something that I want to spend just a few minutes talking about. So if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see a quote by Louisa Moats that comes from her first edition of her Speech to Print book. Many of you may be familiar with that, but take just a moment to read that quote. This really strikes a chord with me, and I bolded the last sentence, which is language itself is the substance of instruction. And I think this is a very important concept to understand around structured literacy and what's behind it. And Charles Perfetti noted this in one of his papers back in 2011, that reading builds on language. And that's an important concept to understand. I think in general, we do understand that, but it may not come to the forefront of our thinking all the time as part of our instruction. As we know, human beings are not wired to learn to read. They have to be explicitly taught, but human beings are wired, of course, to learn language and to speak language. But reading and writing, as I said, have to be taught. And so these domains of language that were referenced in the previous slide in that what of structured literacy graphic, these domains are listed here in bold. Not all of them, but most of them. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is just make some connections with you all with the language of those domains of language and the instructional components of reading and structured literacy that we're going to be talking about over the next hour. So phonology is, of course, related to our sound system. Phonemes are the basic units of sound. Our orthography is referencing our writing system, specifically how words are spelled. And then pragmatics really is not as noted here, but it's certainly the social understandings around communication and the idioms that may occur in language. Morphology is another domain of language that's an important piece, and morphemes compose the smallest units of meaning. Just like phonemes are the smallest units of sound, morphemes are the smallest units of meaning. And so word parts such as prefixes and suffixes, Greek and Latin roots are all parts of word parts that have meaning. And so that's an important component to focus on and teach. Semantics is another important part of reading, and that relates to meaning. And so that's vocabulary, that's passage understanding, sentence meaning as well. Discourse structure is referencing how we compose language when we're telling a story or giving directions of some sort. And this is noted also in text structures when we're reading. And we'll get into more of that information a little bit later this session. And then sentences are another big part of language, of course, and that's syntax, that's word order, that's grammar, and those play have a huge impact on meaning as well. So that's a quickie overview on the domains of language. And then here they are again on the right side of your screen. And I connected these to the National Reading Panel 5 Essential Components of Reading that I think everyone is familiar with, and showing this kind of reciprocal relationship between the domains of language and those 5 components. And what's interesting to note is that some of the components of reading have multiple connections to the domains of language. For instance, you see phonics here, not only related to phonology, but also orthography, the way words are spelled, and also morphology. And Carrie will be talking a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes, about that connection. And then the other thing, if you think about the flip side of that, morphology, when you think about morphology and its relationship to the 5 components, it really addresses phonics as well as vocabulary. So just wanted to make that connection, that this maybe for some folks might be new language around the domains of language, but connecting the dots here between the 5 components and what we're going to be talking about with structured literacy, I think was an important entry into this session here. So I'm going to turn this over to Carrie now, who's going to talk about word recognition and handwriting and spelling.
Great, thank you, Dale. So I will start by walking you all through the what in terms of word recognition, handwriting, and spelling. And so we'll work our way through those subcomponents on the the left-hand side of the infographic one by one. And as we do so, I want to define what those terms mean, but I also want to talk about what in terms of what to teach for each of those components. Next slide. So we'll dive in and we'll start with phonemes and graphemes. Next slide. So in terms of definitions, what is a phoneme? A phoneme is simply an individual speech sound. And in the English language, we have roughly 44 phonemes. There's some disagreement about the exact number, but most agree about 44. And a grapheme would be a written representation of one sound. We only have 44 phonemes in English. However, there are over 250 graphemes to represent those phonemes. So let's talk about why that is. So 2 points of clarification about graphemes. Number one is that many phonemes are represented by more than one grapheme. So if you take the phoneme A, so the long A sound, for example, there are actually 8 different ways that you can spell that sound A. So you could spell it with the letter A, like in favor, or with the A consonant E in a word like late. We have AI like in bait, AY like in say, EA in a word like steak, EI in a word like veil, and of course EY in they, and then EIGH in a word like slay. So one phoneme, we have 8 different graphemes to represent that phoneme. So it gets a little bit complicated, but we can teach students all of the different graphemes that represent the phonemes in English. One other piece of information that I wanted to highlight about graphemes is that graphemes, as you just saw, can consist of one letter or more than one letter. So let's take a closer look. Next slide. And I want to look at some examples of graphemes here on the table. So let's just start with the top row, and our phoneme is and examples of words that have that phoneme are words like mit, comb, and him. And when you think about how we spell that sound in each of those 3 words, it varies. So in the word mit, it's spelled with an M. In the word comb, we spell with an MB. And then in the word him, we spell with an MN. So again, just getting at that point that for many of the phonemes in English language, there are several different ways we can spell them, or there are several different graphemes that represent that phoneme. One thing to think about is if you take a word like the word pause, for example, and you think about, okay, how many phonemes are in the word pause? There are 3 phonemes, p, a, s. And then if you ask the question, well, how many graphemes are in the word pause? Well, there are 3 graphemes because there's one grapheme to represent each of those 3 sounds or phonemes. But here's the trick question. How many letters are in the word pause? Well, there are actually 5 letters, because one of the graphemes in the word pause is actually consists of 2 letters. So a little tricky, but we can definitely teach students how those graphemes represent the phonemes and how to spell the different graphemes. Next slide. So when you think about teaching and how we're going to help students make the connection between the phonemes and the graphemes, we utilize phonics, and phonics is defined as it's a method of instruction that teaches students that relationship between the letters and letter combinations in our written language, and then the individual sounds in our spoken language, and then how to use those relationships to actually read and to spell words. Next slide. So again, thinking about phonemes and graphemes, what should you be teaching in this area? First of all, you want to make sure that your students know how to pronounce each of the 44 phonemes in English. You want to make sure that when given a word orally, that they're able to isolate those individual sounds in a word and also be able to blend them together orally. You also want to teach students those sound symbol correspondences. So when you hear the sound how do you spell the sound We want to make sure we teach students how to decode words, meaning looking at a word, looking at each letter in the word and connecting those letters to sounds, and then blending the sounds together to identify the word. We want to make sure we teach students how to write each of those sounds. And also we want to make sure that we very explicitly teach them how to spell. Next slide. So this is a quote from Catherine Snow and colleagues, which I really like. Spelling and reading build and rely on the same mental representation of a word. Knowing the spelling of a word makes the representation of it sturdy and accessible for fluent reading. I love that word sturdy in that quote. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is that there's this connection between, if students are strong spellers, how that's going to assist them in being more fluent readers. So kind of integrating and making sure we're building automaticity and fluency. So this is just one example of that. Next slide. So how do we integrate encoding into our decoding instruction? Because encoding is really going to reinforce the decoding instruction that we're providing to students. So in CORE's Teaching Reading Source Book, we have a number of sample lessons that show how to use something that we call word work to integrate encoding into the phonics instruction. So what do we mean by word work? We define it as kind of this broad term that describes a range of activities that leads students to practicing those sound spelling patterns by building words, by manipulating words, and by sorting words. And these word work activities provide actual practice with both encoding and decoding. And you can conduct these activities with manipulative materials, but also through writing, which is where that encoding comes in. Next slide. Some examples of word work activities, and I'll show you some specific activities as we get a little bit farther in. But activities like word sorting, using Elkonin boxes to have students segment words and then write the grapheme for each sound in those boxes. Activities like word building, where you have students start by writing a word like add, and then have them change add to spell had, and then change had to spell sad. So students are systematically changing one of the sounds in the word and then making that change, the corresponding change with the spelling of the word. Dictation is also a key activity that's part of word work. Next slide. One of the pieces of the source book that CORE is best known for is what we call the explicit phonics lesson sequence. And what this is a daily instructional sequence that is used both in whole group and in small group instruction to teach phonics very explicitly and systematically, and in doing so, to integrate the encoding piece to that daily instruction. So if you look quickly at these 6 steps of this daily explicit phonics lesson routine, you always start with step 1 by developing phonemic awareness with some target sounds. Then introducing whatever the new sound spelling correspondence is. When you do step 2, you also at that point want to have students practice the handwriting of that new sound spelling correspondence. Moving on to step 3, students then get to sound out and read words that have both the new sound and review sounds. Step 4 is to always include, even if it's just 30 seconds or a minute, of practice in building automatic word recognition, doing some fluency exercises at the word level. Step 5, huge important step, is to provide the opportunity for students to apply their phonics and decoding knowledge to decodable text. And step 5 is so important because this is the place where you provide the opportunity for that sort of massed practice of phonics that really leads to mastery of those skills. And then finally, in step 6, as we were just talking about, here's where we're going to integrate the encoding to reinforce the phonics instruction. And we do that through word work, like some of the examples I just shared with you. So we talked about phonemes and graphemes and how they're connected through our instruction. So the next piece we want to talk about under word recognition is morphemes. And Dale gave you a little preview of the definition, but let's take a look at the next slide. And the way we define a morpheme in the source book is simply the meaningful part of a word, or the meaningful parts of words, also known as word part clues. Next slide. So if you're trying to wrap your head around what a morpheme is, it's important to know that a morpheme may be one syllable, like pig is a morpheme, but it also can be more than one syllable. So elephant is actually one morpheme. Morpheme may be a whole word, like we just looked at, elephant, or a morpheme may be a word part. Next slide. Morphemes can also be what we call free or bound. So a free morpheme is basically a morpheme that can stand alone as a word all by itself. So some examples of free morphemes are like help, play, run. And then bound morphemes, these are morphemes that cannot stand alone as words. So as you're looking at this table on the slide, you're probably recognizing many common morphemes. So things like prefixes, dis, in, re. We have derivational suffixes like full, less, ly. Those are all bound morphemes. Some suffixes like ed, the plural es, ing, and so forth. But also we have many Greek roots and Latin roots that are also considered to be bound morphemes. Next slide. So I love this example. This is an example I always use when talking about morphemes with teachers and students. So if you take the word water and you ask yourself, what's the smallest part of that word that carries meaning? Because that's the definition of a morpheme. And in the word water, the smallest part of that word that carries meaning is actually water, right? And we all know what water is. But now I want you to consider the word painter. And painter actually consists of 2 morphemes because there are 2 parts to that word that each carry their own meaning. That suffix represents one who. And paint, we all know what paint is. So painter is defined as one who paints. So two morphemes in the word painter, paint and just looking for those chunks in words that carry meaning. That's what morphemes are all about. So moving to, thanks, Dale, the next slide, which is, okay, when we think about morphemes, what do we teach? What's really critical to include in our instruction? So first of all, we want to make sure that we provide explicit instruction for students in recognizing those morphemes or those word parts that carry meaning, because this is going to give students additional strategies for reading and chunking longer multisyllabic words. And why is that? It's because the brain's orthographic processor has to learn to kind of see these common letter patterns and recurring word parts in order to read words in text fluently and accurately. So when you're presenting multisyllabic words to students, if they can start to chunk those morphemes in words, that's going to help them read those words more automatically. And we can also leverage our instruction on morphemes to include the connection to encoding or spelling. Because if students know how to spell the common morphemes, this is going to help them then spell those multisyllabic words that are longer. So let's look at examples of how to teach morphemes. And we're going to start with a really brief video of an example how teaching morphemes will help students improve their decoding skills. So this instructional sequence focuses on what they call morphemic transformations. And the teacher is, again, helping the students build their skills with decoding multisyllabic words. This particular instructional routine comes from a program called SIPS, which stands for Systematic Instruction in Phoneme Awareness, Phonics, and Sight Words. And it comes from the challenge level of SIPS. And what you're going to see this teacher, who also happens to be one of our colleagues at CORE, her name is Anne Leon, she's going to be teaching students to work with the word expect, and she's going to transform that word expect to different words by adding different morphemes to it. So Dale, can you go ahead and press that video?
Absolutely.
Expect. Read. Expect. Read. Ed. Read. Expected. Read. Un. Read. Unexpected. Read. Lee. Read. Unexpectedly. Prevent. Read. Prevent. Read. Ed. Read. Prevented. Read. Ing. Read. Preventing. Read. Able. Read. Preventable. Read. Shun. Careful here. Read. Prevention.
Okay, thank you, Dale. So one of the pieces of that instructional routine that you don't see captured in the video clip is the teacher typically takes each form of the word and uses that word in a sentence. And the reason why that's so important is that really helps reinforce the meaning of those different forms of the word, which again is all about integrating the word recognition with the comprehension piece of reading comprehension. So walking through quickly, Dale, I'm very aware of my time here, so I will go lightning speed. So I did want to show you an encoding example of teaching morphemes. And this is a word work activity that comes directly from the source book. And basically what you can do is you can give your students kind of a 2-syllable root word to start with. And I'm going to use depend as the example. And you would write the word depend on the board and then essentially challenge your students to take that root word and create a list of as many words as they can by adding one or more affixes to the root word. So if you told them to work with the root word depend, they might write words like depended, dependable, dependent, independent, independence, and so forth. And it's a really fun activity. I actually remember doing it as a student in grade school, and it just being really motivated by trying to come up with as many words as I could with that root word. Next slide. I'm just going to make a really quick point here. Again, going back to that integration between word recognition and the comprehension pieces of reading, is that we can also leverage our instruction on morphemes to focus on meaning, because by learning the meanings of these morphemes, students can then use that knowledge of meanings for independent word learning. So as early as 2nd grade, teachers can begin instruction in teaching students how compound words work, teaching them about word families using that, again, that constant root word, and showing them how the different morphemes that you add to that root word change the meaning of that root word. And also introduce some simple prefixes and suffixes. So next slide. So that if students have this knowledge of meanings of a number of very common morphemes, they can use that knowledge to determine word meaning. And in the source book, we have a very simple strategy that we teach students to help them become independent word learners. And we just tell them simply to take a word, look for the root word, look for the root word. What does the root word mean? Then look for a prefix. What does the prefix in that word mean? Look for a suffix, if there's one. What does the suffix in that word mean? And then to put all of those parts together and think about what is the meaning of the whole word. So if you think about the word disagreement, you start with, okay, agree, to have the same opinion. Okay, the prefix is dis. Well, I learned that that means not or opposite. There's a suffix, ment, which we also learned means the state or quality of something. So if I put all of those meaningful units together in that word, dis, agree, ment, it would mean the state or quality of not having the same opinion. So you can figure out pretty darn close what the meaning of a word is by looking at those units of meaning within the word. So teaching morphemes is like double duty. You get, more for your money when you teach your morphemes. Next slide.
One thing I would just add to that, Carrie, is that even if they didn't know, for example, what meant actually meant, when they're seeing it in the context of a sentence, and I'm going to get to this when I talk about syntactic awareness, they can still figure out the meaning of the word, because in this case, it's a noun, right? Disagree would be something that's more of a verb. And so they would just inherently kind of get it just by knowing that if they know the agree, what that means, and dis, they could figure it out even if they're not quite clear on what the meant part of it means. Just want to pop that in there.
Great, thank you. All right, syllable and stress patterns is our next piece of word recognition. So defining syllable. So a syllable is a word or a part of a word pronounced as a unit. Each syllable contains one vowel sound. A syllable may contain more than one vowel letter, however, but the letters within a syllable will only represent one vowel sound. So for example, if you think about the word repeat, 2 syllables, repeat, and if you look at the syllable peat, you hear one vowel sound, E, but that vowel sound is spelled with 2 letters, E-A. Next slide. Okay, so why do we want to teach syllables? What's the connection to decoding? So while phonics instruction gives students the basic tools to decode most single syllable words, providing explicit instruction in recognizing syllables and morphemes will give students additional strategies for reading the longer multisyllabic words. And we can't just stop after teaching kids how to decode single syllable words. We have to teach them syllables and morphemes so that they have strategies for decoding multisyllabic words. Next slide, a little bit more about the why we teach syllables. When skilled readers encounter a multisyllabic word, they're going to automatically try to break it down into smaller units based on the brain's memory of the common letter patterns found in other words. So if you teach them to begin to recognize those common syllables, those common morphemes, their brain will begin to automatically recognize them and chunk and read words automatically. One other kind of integration example I wanted to point out here is this quote, that is, knowing what a word means will help students come up with its pronunciation after the sounds and syllables, that should say, are decoded. So if students know the meaning of a word, that's going to assist with the pronunciation when they're trying to decode a longer word that maybe they've never decoded before, but they've heard it before and they know the meaning of it. So there's strength in teaching vocabulary and teaching students to be independent word learners because the meaning is going to ultimately help with the decoding of multisyllabic words. Next slide. In terms of the what to teach with syllables, you want to make sure you teach students syllable types, principles for dividing words into syllables, and how to spell multisyllabic words. Next slide. I think many of you are familiar with the 6 syllable types. This is just a quick summary of what those 6 syllable types are that you want to teach students. Next slide. And here is a list of some syllable division principles that are high mileage principles that you would want to explicitly teach your students. And again, this is just a poor example. Next slide. I do want to take a second and look more carefully at this piece because here's an example of a word work activity that focuses on multisyllabic words. And this is a dictation activity. You can see there are 4 steps when you're practicing spelling multisyllabic words. The teacher will introduce the word, then work with the students to count the syllables in the word, work with the students to spell each syllable in the word, and then finally provide the correct spelling of the word and have the students check their spelling against the correct spelling and fix up as needed. So this is a great little routine, again, found in the source book. That's a kind of a high leverage, a high mileage routine. Next slide. And then finally, when we think about word recognition, we also want to make sure that as a teacher, you know what we mean by orthographic conventions and you know what you should be teaching in this area. So let's start with a quick definition. When we use the word orthography, what that means is the conventional spelling system of a language. So English has a particular orthography or like a spelling system. And the word orthography comes, it's based on ortho, which stands for proper or correct, and graph, which means writing. So orthography just means correct writing. Again, thinking about your spelling, conventional spelling in a language. Next slide. So here's the thing. Many people, when they think of English, they think of English as being highly irregular, but that is actually not the case. There are 5 principles of English spelling, And the spelling of almost any word can be explained by taking into account one or more of those 5 principles. And I'm going to let you look through those 5 principles. And when you take those 5 principles into consideration, that would only leave about 4% of all English words in print that are truly irregular. So bottom line here is that we need to teach students all of those principles of our English spelling system. Next slide. One of those principles was that we do have certain conventions or rules in our English spelling. And again, here's a table pulled from the source book. And one example of one of those spelling generalizations that we need to teach students is for most singular nouns, all we have to do is add S to form the plural, right? When you have a singular noun that ends with S, double S, CH, SH, etc., then the rule is you add ES to make it plural. So we have these rules or conventions or generalizations, whatever you want to call them, in our English language that will teach students how to spell the bulk of English words in our language. Next slide. Some other examples of those spelling principles in English. English words don't end in V. What we do in English is we add an E after the V if the word ends in V. So instead of give being spelled G-I-V, in English, we spell give G-I-V-E. So we have these rules and we just need to make sure we teach them explicitly and systematically. Next slide. And it's going to take some time to teach all of those 5 principles of English language. You can't just do it all in 1 year. And there's a wonderful article that came out in 2005 in The American Educator by Louisa Moats, which is called How Spelling Supports Reading. And she goes through those 5 principles of our English language in detail. And she also lays out a plan for how you can teach those 5 principles across K-6. And she even talks about what to do in grades 7, 8. So I don't know if any of you have ever taught a program called Spelling Mastery, which is a direct instruction program, but that was a program that I taught when I was a special education teacher. And it had 6 levels that would go across the grade levels. And essentially each level covered what you see here, starting in K, going all the way through 5 and 6. So as a teacher, I found it very helpful that I could just follow the scope and sequence of that particular program. Next slide. Okay, Dale, sorry for hogging your time.
Okay.
Over.
This is important stuff, so it's all good. So I'm going to be working with the right side of the what and focusing on comprehension and composition. So vocabulary and background knowledge, sentence structure, text structure, critical thinking will be the pieces of the puzzle related to language comprehension. Carrie did a great job of talking about integration. And one of the things that we can think about is there was integration in many of her examples to comprehension. So these 2 arrows here that go back and forth are relating to that idea of integration of meaning with the language forms that we're trying to teach in terms of phonemes, phonology, morphology, and orthography, which is what she focused on here. So in my part, I'm going to be talking about syntax related to sentence structure and also semantics, which is related to meaning and meaning making. So first, we're going to talk about vocabulary and background knowledge. So I love this quote by Stephen Stahl. This is also in our source book. The idea that vocabulary knowledge is knowledge, and that the knowledge of a word not just only implies a definition, but it implies about how that word fits into the world. And as we learn more about the world through reading and engaging with having life experiences, those labels or words that represent that growing knowledge also become more precise and vast. So we get more precision about how to use specific words, and we also gain, so that's really kind of a depth of vocabulary, but then also we have a vast knowledge over the lifespan. And what I really love about this, Scarborough's reading rope, you could spend so much time talking about it. One thing I'll say is what Carrie really talked about in her portion was word recognition. And these really are what we call constrained skills. There's a lifespan to this, that ideally these are finite skills that have to be learned, and they can be learned ideally in elementary school, right? All the things that Carrie talked about. And then the language comprehension strand really are referred to as unconstrained skills that researchers refer to as unconstrained skills, that this knowledge builds across a lifetime. We continually experience new things. We read more, we gain more background knowledge, we gain more vocabulary, we gain more opportunities for verbal reasoning. So this happens as long as we're living and interacting in the world and reading and writing. We're going to continue building our language comprehension skills. The other reason why I showed this is that I wanted to emphasize this point. And I don't think it's by coincidence that these two are listed at the top of the language comprehension strand, that both of these are extremely important to comprehension. And when we think about vocabulary knowledge, there is a wealth of research that shows a very high correlation from vocabulary to students' ability to comprehend text. Not to say that these other pieces aren't important, but there's a very high correlation with this. And the other thing I'll say is that background knowledge and vocabulary, like Stephen Stahl just pointed out in his previous slide, that they're really closely related to one another. So some things to think about with knowledge development is that when you're thinking as a teacher, thinking about how to build knowledge in your classroom, select texts that really are going to be rich in that knowledge building opportunity. And students need, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to vocabulary, but students really need an opportunity to hear words used again and again in different contexts, and also learn content in different contexts and read different books and different text complexities, if you will, around the knowledge that they're building. And so there's a good opportunity here in classrooms to provide listening opportunities for students to build that background knowledge. And students, there's lots of research evidence to point to the fact that kids across elementary school and even into middle school can really listen to complex text above their grade level, and really listen and discuss the text and really learn and grow in their comprehension and language comprehension and background knowledge. We want opportunities as part of that listening to a read aloud to have opportunities to discuss the text. So kids sitting together, in talking together in partners, but also sharing out in whole group opportunities, thinking about character motives, even looking at vocabulary words and talking about the meanings. There's lots of avenues you can go down in classroom discussions of text. The other thing, when you think about the opportunities for read aloud in the classroom, that then kids are learning more about their learning background knowledge and content knowledge as part of those read aloud opportunities. We want to give them opportunities for independent reading in the classroom. So our school libraries and our classroom libraries really can help emphasize and extend the learning from the classroom discussions and listening opportunities that were provided for independent reading. And so a school can really think carefully when they're choosing a curriculum to really focus on building background knowledge and content knowledge. And this is a huge focus in our conversations today nationally about reading instruction. So I know that this is not news to most of you. The last thing I'll say about another way to support knowledge development is the opportunity to write. to write about what it is kids are learning, thinking about, again, not just answering questions of the text, but also having opportunities to think critically, write research reports, and show kind of what they know through writing. And that's going to build lots of opportunities for learning the content even more deeply when they're having to think and write about it, because thinking and writing are very inextricably linked processes. I know for myself, I think better through writing than I do talking. So back to vocabulary, we want to, this is from our teaching reading source book. It's a chart in there that talks about two types of vocabulary instruction. One is incidental vocabulary learning here on the left, and on the right, we have intentional vocabulary teaching. So just as I talked about these rich oral language experiences and wide reading in the classroom where teachers are using academic language on a daily basis in their daily talk with students, giving directions and telling about in just their instruction in general, they don't want to use simple language. They want to use rich academic language so that kids will really have those rich oral language experiences as they're listening to it. Wide reading, teacher read alouds and independent reading, I talked about already and gave some rationale for that. So I'll move over here to intentional vocabulary teaching. And that comprises two main ideas. One is specific word instruction, which many of you may have heard of Isabel Beck and her wonderful book, her and Margaret McCown's book, Bringing Words to Life. It's a great book. It was first written in 2002 and had a second edition in 2012 or 2013, I believe. And there's a lot of great information in that book about how to teach words specifically. And our source book also in our vocabulary chapter on specific word instruction goes in depth into this rich and robust instruction. And that means that we teach words with a student-friendly definition. We give them opportunities to use the word in different contexts, hear examples of the word being used in context, and have opportunities and fun activities to use the words in different ways and build that as part of their oral language and their written language. The second main idea, and Carrie touched on this earlier, is this idea of word learning strategies. And you'll see 4 strategies here. And Carrie really talked about in depth morphemic analysis, but dictionary use and teaching kids the proper use of how to use dictionaries, and also using context clues to help them figure out the meaning of words that they might not know as they're reading. And also supporting English learners and to teach them to think about cognates, words that are similar. In English, and I'll use Spanish as an example. There are many words that sound the same and have a very close meaning. And so cognate awareness is another way to think about word learning strategies. And underpinning all of this is word consciousness, and teaching kids to really be interested in words and playing games with words and understanding where words come from, that word origin. So next, I'll talk about sentence structure and grammar and syntax. The role of word order is very important, and I'll let you read this quote by Margie Gillis and Nancy Eberhardt. And both of them authored this book. It's a great book called Syntax Knowledge to Practice. If you don't know about it, I would highly recommend looking it up. And it will give you lots of examples and ways to think about teaching syntax, which is an important component that really is not addressed in a lot of curricula. So really good here. And one of the things I would say is when we go back to our conversation about reading aloud and discussing text, this is where this idea of listening and speaking and reading and writing sentences are going to help kids think about syntactic awareness and develop that over time. Word order impacts meaning is another important concept around syntax. So when we look at these two examples here, the function of the word brick changed in both these instances from a noun naming a type of building material to an adjective describing the color red. And so teaching students that particular idea, that the way the words are positioned in the sentence will convey a different type of meaning for that word. So again, another example of this is when we consider the first example, the light from the fire was bright. That really is telling us what? In this case, it's a noun, right? And so what was bright? The light from the fire, right? Or just the light. In the second example, I will light the fire now, the word is a verb. And so it's explaining what's happening, all right? And so we can start to teach kids to think about sentences and what kinds of questions those sentences are answering. All right. And so here's an example of that. Again, this is pulled from this type of instruction, and thinking about the function of different words or phrases will come out of this book, Syntax Knowledge to Practice. So the quote by Madsen and Paulson here explains that syntax explicitly conveys information about how the word meaning should be integrated into a proposition or an idea unit, so that the reader does not have to infer who did what to whom. And you can see in this particular sentence here, those questions are all, that question is being answered in the phrases that are written there. Benjamin Banneker is the who, wrote a letter is the did what, and then to Thomas Jefferson is to whom. And sentences will not always follow this pattern, but you can think about, and this book talks about different ways of asking the questions to help students focus in on the meaning for that particular sentence and how it's constructed. So features of effective syntax instruction are going to identify the function as the main focus, so that the whole intention is to extract meaning. We're not trying to label nouns and verbs and adjectives, although there's an importance to grammar, but it should be in the context of what function that word plays in the sentence and what role does it have in meaning making. And using those functional questions, like I described here, to scaffold language processing. So who did what to whom is an example of functional questions to scaffold the language processing. We want to teach explicitly. We want to point out, just like I showed you on the previous slide, what the different parts of the sentences are doing, and then providing practice using oral language and also text. So text structure, in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to get through these last couple points here. Text structure is an important concept that readers who are familiar with a particular structure of the text have several advantages. They know what to expect from the different parts of the text, where to search for particular types of information, and how the different parts of the text are linked together. Oops, sorry about that. And so when we think about, there's two main types of text structures. There's narrative structure and informational structure, and informational text structure. And with narrative, I think many of you are very familiar. I think we're all familiar with it. We learn it from an early age, this idea of setting characters, plot, and theme. Kids come learning, knowing about narrative structure inherently. They're read to, they watch TV, they hear adults telling stories. So they have a sense of all of these components. And so we start from there in narrative structure, and we work our way quickly into informational structure, which are 5 different types. And each has a different purpose. These are charts both from our source book in our comprehension chapter and on our talk about text structures. Signaling devices are very important for informational text, and we can teach those text features and signal words as part of our instruction around informational text. So text features are the titles, the headings in the sections of the text, the diagrams or tables that really show and summarize the information that students have read. And this really helps focus the students' attention on the text, supporting understanding and organization and content of the text. Signal words are found, and that's important. Another chart from our source book gives the different type of text structures with signal words and sample topic sentences. I brought this back from Barbara Wilson's presentation last month, that graphic organizers really are helpful in helping teach kids about the different structures of the different informational structures. I would say that it's not about filling out the graphic organizer. It's about showing how that can help students comprehend the text. Lastly, I'll say about critical thinking is just please read through that quote by Natalie Wexler, who's done a lot of writing about content knowledge, background knowledge, and how critical it is. Okay, sorry, we're running through real quick here. Visualization, comprehension, monitoring, prediction, and inferencing skills are all part of critical thinking. I want to just bring us back to this rope, Scarborough's rope, that vocabulary, background knowledge, and verbal reasoning are all linked together, because without background knowledge and vocabulary, it's very hard to inference and make predictions in what you're doing. Lastly, in our source book, we talk about QAR, question answer relationships. It's a questioning strategy to help students understand and help them with critical thinking about whether the answer is right there in the text. They can just point to it by looking at one sentence, or if they have to think and search across the text, or if they need to use a combination or their background knowledge to answer the question, or whether the author and me, which is a combination of the text itself and also working with your world knowledge to really answer that question. So that's another opportunity for critical thinking. Lastly, I'll say that what we tried to do today was give you an overall sense of the what of structured literacy, showing that the integration of the word recognition strand and language comprehension strand is critical, so that integrated language reading and writing instruction that supports automaticity, fluency, and reading proficiency is happening. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I will quickly turn it back over to Jessica and the team.
Thank you so much, Dr. Webster and Dr. Thomas-Beck, for that amazing, wonderful presentation, chock full of information. Since we are about to part, we do have a few things we want to share with you all before it's time to leave. I wanted to mention the companion document that we've created to accompany each webinar. The webinar companion document includes prompts to discuss after attending webinar and additional resources to further explore the webinar content. These companion documents and recordings can be found at scoe.net/CA dyslexia or on the Padlet that Wynn has been posting in the chat. Next slide, please. CDI is also hosting a professional learning network in the spring. Please do register. These are amazing presentations that are not to be missed. And next slide, please. Finally, this is our survey. It's really important for us to hear from you. So please do enter in your feedback before you leave today, and we can make sure to continue to tailor these expert webinars to your needs. The link is in the chat. Well, that's all we have time for today. So Dr. Webster, Dr. Carrie Thomas-Beck, I want to thank you for your time on behalf of Glean Education, Sacramento County Office of Education, and the California Dyslexia Initiative. And thank you so much to our wonderful attendees. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar with Dr. Anita Archer on the how of structured literacy. And that's on November 9th, 2023. Please register for that. The link is in the chat. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you so much. We'll give you another minute to be able to grab the links in the chat before we close out. But take care. Happy to see you here today.